Chapter 4 The Savage World. Picture Allison, a teenage girl in a family in distress. Her father had lost his job and stays at home all day. Her mother yells too much, eats too much, does not care about how she looks or sounds. Allison cannot stand the idea that they are related. Her parents are constantly arguing, or her older brother Nick is out all night drinking, fighting, hanging out with kids who have been in and out of jail. Allison dresses carefully, first in matching muted colors, then only in white. She begins to eat ever less, soon just tiny bites of food cut into precise squares and sips of filtered water. Allison manages the chaos of her home by aiming to be totally in control. Food revolts her, as does the thought of doing anything that could mean her body rules her mind. As she is taken off to the hospital in an ambulance, Allison believes she has been given a message from God. If we lost all of our flesh, reduced ourselves to bones and spirit, we would be cured of all human failures. This invented story of modern anorexia echoes the ideas and experiences of many elite Christians after the fall of Rome. The need to become pure meant everything to them. The great Roman world was hacked into pieces by men with swords, but it's fair to say that Augustine, a bishop from what is now Algeria, was the person most responsible for the destruction of the ideas of the old empire. The decade after the Visigoths rampaged through Rome, Augustine wrote The City of God to offer a Christian explanation of those grim events. In so doing, he shaped the ideas and beliefs of educated Europeans for the next 1,000 years. Augustine turned the old Roman society of status, power, and rank upside down. Now, absolutely none of that mattered. What good did an emperor's purple robe, or rich man's slaves, a lustful master's mistresses do him now? When Rome was in flames, everything of this world, fame, wealth, conquest, an empire that stretched for thousands of miles, was fragile, temporary, in a word, meaningless. Rome was the city of man, the testament to what humans could create. All that could be gone in the blink of an eye. The only way to eternal truth, to a foundation that would never waver, was by admitting our weaknesses as humans and turning to the Lord. In a sense, Augustine was Rome reversed. Where Rome relied on the power of armies, he believed only in the power of God. Where Rome's grand buildings displayed the wealth of an empire, he saw God in every bird, star, mountain, and gust of wind. Where Rome had bullies' confidence in its ability to crush the weak, slaves, women, conquered people, he thought all humans were as slaves before God. In Augustine's world, religion was not part of life, it was life. God was why the sun rose in the morning, and why women gave birth. God invented the differences among people for his own reasons. To ask, are people from Asia, or Africa, or another part of Europe inferior beings, would not make any sense. The only questions would be, why did God put people in those places, and can they be saved? For the slaves, the poor, the conquered peoples Rome had ruled, Augustine's message offered the most wonderful hope. A slave was as likely to go to heaven for all eternity as was his master, perhaps more so. Augustine did not oppose slavery itself. That was because nothing about earthly life mattered to him. Next to eternal life, next to the grace of God, how could grubby day-to-day living mean anything at all? If you want to know why barbarians could bring ruin, Augustine said, look to yourselves, to your sins. You suffer because you defy God. He was sure, because he knew how much he loved evil. Augustine was the most astute observer of the human mind. He mapped so clearly how our resolutions to be good fail. More than any other writer before him, he understood that terrible instant when your inner feelings trip you up and warp your thoughts. In his Confessions, Augustine recalled that as a teenager, he could enjoy doing wrong for no other reason than that it was wrong. Even as he described the power and beauty and grace of God, he revealed exactly how weak, how helpless to improve ourselves, how self-destructive we are. For Christians, trying to make sense of their darkening world, Augustine offered insight and comfort. Recognize your own sins, reject the physical world, and turn only to God. The sharp sword of Augustine's intellect cut clean, dividing the world into spirit and flesh, the saved and the damned. But how could people put his ideas into practice? By living in the harshest, most isolated places, hermits tried to remove themselves from all temptation. Men and women starved themselves. In their monasteries, monks and nuns spent their days praying and laboring to preserve scraps of ancient texts. Most people, were not ready to lead such severe lives. It was all they could do just to survive. As Rome weakened, one after another, invading people swept across Europe, until those marauding tribes learned Latin. Many had no written languages, and their laws and governments were direct, brutal, and primitive. If a poor person was accused of a crime, he would be put to ordeal, made to grasp a glowing hot rod. If 3 days later his skin blistered, he was guilty. Hot water would work just as well. The ordeal was intended to find the accused guilty. It was a ritual that allowed the people of a small town to say out loud what they were already thinking in private. The shift from the polished Latin of Roman texts to the grim ordeal in Woodside clearing was just one sign of a particularly unstable and violent era. And like any such time in which people are isolated and frightened, xenophobia, fear, and thus hatred of strangers flourished. A fragmented Europe was returning to the most primitive instinct. We are human. Whoever comes down the road probably is not. To get a sense of Europe in the Dark Ages, you can picture a muddy, overgrown Roman road leading past an endless forest. Dense stands of birch, oak, and maple teem with wildlife. Deer, boar, bears, bison, wild goats, and especially wolves. Wolves were so ferocious and plentiful in France that in 846 one even walked into a church during a service. The dangerous dark forest that appears in so many myths and legends was, at that time, simply a fact of life. Danger loomed just outside every small village. Vikings first attacked Lindisfarne, an island off the coast of England, in 793. One chronicler described the wild Norsemen as being like steaming hornets or wolves. They robbed, tore, and slaughtered without mercy. The lucky monks were taken as slaves, the rest were driven naked into the freezing waters. The first raid was only a hint of devastation the Vikings would bring from the sea. It's easy to think of any babbling neighbor just across the mountain range as a monster. Chronicles from the time described the Slavs as slave-like and even claimed that the two words were related. To this day, scholars cannot agree on the origins of the two words. A soldier said of the Weds, a people who had migrated into what is now Germany around AD 500, "What did those little frog matters to me? I could carry 7, 8, or even 9 of them about, shown up on my lace." Another writer spoke of Bretons, people who speak a language similar to Welsh and who had fled Britain from northern France also around 500. They inhabit the forests and make their beds in the thickets. They live like savage beasts. Italians, in turn, were dismissed as drunken and soft, satisfied to fill their stomachs with wine and abundant dishes. By contrast, the law of Franks proclaimed that they themselves were of noble stature, brilliant whiteness of skin, exceptional beauty, daring, swift, and hardy. The worst news of all came from the Holy Land. Believers in a new religion had conquered the very sacred ground where Jesus had preached, suffered, and died. Living the ancient and biblical lands of Abraham, Muhammad was an Arab who honored Moses and Jesus. But around the year 610, he began to receive new revelations from God, Allah. Like Judaism and Christianity, Islam insists that the divisions among men are unimportant. We must submit to the all-merciful, the all-compassionate God. Islam, the religion built on God's message as passed on by Muhammad, transformed the Middle East. Muhammad's message of brotherhood and devotion to a single God felt as right and true to the peoples of the Middle East as Christianity had to those in Rome. By conversion and conquest, Islam, another word for the Muslim religion, not only took control of the Holy Land and the sites of the earliest Christian communities, but it swept across North Africa and into Europe. In 711, the Muslims began the invasion that made them rulers in most of Spain. First Christian Rome was destroyed, now even fragmented Christian Europe was under assault. Holy War. Picture Allison and Nick, the girl starving herself to be perfectly pure, and her gang member brother. What if, in her meditations, Allison made an astonishing discovery? God had a new mission for everyone. The pure wearing white cotton as well as the tattooed crude on the streets. They must unite in a fierce army and take back the Holy Land from the vile enemy that now occupied it. What joyous news! The scholar points the way and the fighter does God's work. Allison is no longer isolated, Nick no longer condemned by his sins. Together again, sister and brother, mind and sword, can bathe the world clean in blood. We call this reunion the Crusades. November 27, 1095, was a turning point in the history of prejudice, for on that day, Pope Urban II began the Crusades. He came before a vast crowd and charged them with a sacred mission: fight the Turks, exterminate them, and then free Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Pope was not just asking knights to go into battle, he was urging them to undertake a holy cause, exactly like the jihad of modern Islamic terrorists. For that reason, anyone who sewed a cloth cross on their shirt and devoted himself to the struggle would be cleansed of sin. The Pope's call offered Europeans a way to overcome the impossible division in their lives. Augustine had written that only God mattered. We must reject the things of this world and pray for God to save us. He thought it would be better if no one married, if there were no children born in sin. That would be a sign that Jesus was about to return. Yet most people did have families and lived brutal, harsh lives. Now Urban provided a way to purity for all. Electrified by Urban's words, the vast throng answered back, "Deus vult," God wills it. That was only the start. As word spread from bishops to monasteries to churches, an army of recruiters spread out to preach and to inspire the faithful. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 people rose up to take the cross. Some were not content with the cloth and branded themselves with the symbol of their mission. This was a war, but it was truly meant to be a holy cause. Urban changed the people of Christian Europe with the mission for which they had prepared since the fall of Rome. As one observer explained at the time, God had institutioned in our time holy wars so that the order of knights and the crowd running its wake might find a new way of gaining salvation. Now, a sinful man, a man who was married and had children and perhaps visited prostitutes, a man who drank and stole, who fought and killed his enemies, could be as pure as a monk or a hermit. Even a woman who was no longer a virgin could be made pure as a nun. All it would take to cleanse the sinful people of Europe was to take back the land where Jesus had walked. The Crusades were violent holiness, holy violence. The two halves of life were joined in doing God's work. Urban told Christians what to do with non-believers. We must drive them out. We must cleanse the Holy Land as thoroughly as a saint who drinks holy water purifies him. Urban hoped to inspire the best-trained warriors, mounted knights, to gather together in one organized army. But his message was too powerful. The legions of recruiters spread the message far and wide. To farmers, monks, women, and children, shepherds minded their flocks. Even a French hermit heard the message. Peter was his name, and he was an exceptionally powerful speaker who wandered from town to town, preaching the holy cause. On Easter Sunday of the following year, 1096, Peter the hermit reached Cologne and spoke to a large gathering. His listeners could not join up fast enough. Strangely enough, the Europeans did not set out with violent prejudice against Muslims. Very few of the people inspired by Urban, and none of those who followed Peter had ever met a Muslim. Other than the Spanish and a smattering of knights and religious men who had gone on previous pilgrimages to Jerusalem, hardly anyone knew anything about Islam. In their first battles against the Muslim Turks, the Europeans were so impressed by their skills that they guessed that the warriors must be long-lost relatives. Anyone who fought that well, they thought, had to be at least partially European. Urban's campaign did not begin as an expression of prejudice against Islam, but the Crusades became that in time. Urban hoped to inspire the best-trained warriors, mounted knights, to gather together in one organized army, but his message was too powerful. The legions of recruiters spread the message far and wide, to farmers, monks, women, and children, shepherds minding their flocks. Even a French hermit heard the message. Peter was his name, and he was exceptionally powerful speaker who wandered from town to town preaching the holy cause. On Easter Sunday of the following year, 1096, Peter the hermit reached Cologne and spoke to a large gathering. His listeners could not join up fast enough. Strangely enough, the Europeans did not set out with violent prejudices against Muslims. Very few of the people inspired by Urban, and none of them who followed Peter, had ever met a Muslim. Other than the Spanish and a smattering of knights and religious men who had gone on previous pilgrimages to Jerusalem, hardly anyone knew anything about Islam. In their first battle against the Muslim Turks, the Europeans were so impressed by their skills that they guessed the warriors must be long-lost relatives. Anyone who fought that well, they thought, had to be at least partially European. Urban's campaign did not begin as an expression of prejudice against Islam, but the Crusades became that in time. In a series of difficult battles and perilous sieges, the main army of trained knights fought its way to Jerusalem. Throughout the campaign, people interpreted the world around them as giving proof that they were on a godly mission. If a comet or shooting star passes the sky, it must be a sign from God. As the warriors camped around the walls of the sacred city, many were overcome with emotion. Some even began to have visions of Jesus and the saints. Even today, visitors to Jerusalem, overawed by the sense of being in a holy place, are given to thinking they are getting special messages from God. This is called the Jerusalem syndrome. When a first assault on the city failed, the ghost of one of their slave leaders appeared to a priest. He warned that the army could enter the city only as a humble man. Trusting in this vision, every knight took off his shoes. As their priest chanted and clutched holy relics, the entire barefoot army walked in a slow, solemn procession around the city. 6 days later, the attacking army breached the walls and entered Jerusalem. Muslims fled from the invaders into the Dome of the Rock, considered one of the holiest sites in the whole world. This beautiful building covers the place in Jerusalem where Muhammad was said to have risen to heaven to meet Abraham and Moses. All the Muslims were murdered. Jews took refuge in the main synagogue in which they were burned alive. One chronicler gleefully reported that in the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees in bridal reins. Indeed, it was just a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers. Since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies, the city was filled with corpses and blood. The Christians won. They captured Jerusalem. This proved to them that they were indeed been doing God's work. The gospel of love was now a religion of holy war. The religious scholar Karen Armstrong believes that to this day, as Jews, Christians, and Muslims clash in Israel and around the world, we are feeling the effects of the Crusades. The murderous hatreds that the Crusades whipped up in Europe, she argues, are a direct cause of the suicide bombs of Islamic terrorists. As diverse as the Crusades were, they had nothing to do with race. A crusade was a mindset of holy violence. It could be directed against anyone. A Christian campaign to regain Spain from its Muslim conquerors was proclaimed a crusade. So too were wars against Slavs and Mongols. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade never managed to reach the Holy Land at all. Instead, the crusade turned into an attack on Constantinople, the capital of the Christian Eastern Empire. Crusading became just about any war in the name of Jesus, the Pope, Christian Europe, even wars between rival people claiming to be the Pope. These wars continued in one form or another until the 16th century. From November 27, 1095 on, one definition of Europe was a place that mounted crusades, holy wars that cleansed Christian fires of sin and aimed to destroy the true faith's demonic enemies. But who were those enemies? The answer to that question helped lay the foundation for our modern idea of race.